All right, hello everyone. So today I wanted to talk to you about this thing called metafiction. So you've probably noticed it without realizing. Part of the reason the things they carried is a different book. One of the reasons is the way it's written, right? It's not written in chronological order. He kind of jumps around in time. But another reason it's pretty unique is this thing called metafiction. And this means that though it's a work of fiction, so it's made up, right, with characters and made up events, um, it within it discusses, describes, or analyzes the writing of fiction or the conventions of fiction. So my best example for you that you've read already is How to Tell a True War Story. So you know the way in that chapter, O'Brien is telling us how to craft a story and how to do it well, and he has lots of characters talking about that. So within this novel that he's writing, he's talking about the craft of writing, which makes you start to think, wait, is this real? Is this the author talking? Right? So it creates some questions, some ambiguity, and that's what we're going to look at today. Why do you think O'Brien uses metafiction? So I'm going to read a few chapters to see how this is happening. So we're going to read a chapter from earlier in the book, Good Form. And so if you don't want to read it with me, you can pause right now and read it by yourself. And if you would like to read along with me, then we're going to do that. It's actually, I'm sorry, it's not from earlier in the book. It's on 171 to 172. So we're just jumping ahead of the next two chapters you're going to read. But you'll see it's okay to read in this order. Okay, so while I'm reading this, notice what O'Brien's saying about the form of his writing. And then after reading, I'm going to have you think and write about a few of these questions. Good form. It's time to be blunt. I'm 43 years old, true, and I'm a writer now. And a long time ago, I walked through Quang Ngai province as a foot soldier. Almost everything else is invented. But it's not a game, it's a form. Right here now, as I invent myself, I'm thinking of all I want to tell you about why this book is written as it is. For instance, I want to tell you this. 20 years ago, I watched a man die on a trail near the village of Maikei. I did not kill him, but I was present, you see, and my presence was guilt enough. I remember his face, which was not a pretty face, because his jaw was in his throat. And I remember feeling the burden of responsibility and grief. I blamed myself, and rightly so, because I was present. But listen, even that story is made up. I want you to feel what I felt. I want you to know why story truth is truer sometimes than happening truth. Here is the happening truth. I was once a soldier. There were many bodies, real bodies with real faces, but I was young then, and I was afraid to look. And now, 20 years later, I'm left with faceless responsibility and faceless grief. Here is the story truth. He was a slim, dead, almost dainty young man of about 20. He lay in the center of a red clay trail near the village of Maikei. His jaw was in his throat. His one eye was shut. The other eye was a star-shaped hole. I killed him. What stories can do, I guess, is make things present. I can look at things I never looked at. I can attach faces to grief and love and pity and God. I can be brave. I can make myself feel again. Daddy, tell the truth, Kathleen can say. Did you ever kill anybody? And I can say, honestly, of course not. Or I can say, honestly, yes. Okay, so I want you to pause now. I want you to write a little about or think a little about these questions. At the end of this today, you're going to do a Flipgrid post. I'm going to be asking you to think about these chapters as I read them because we're going to read one more today. So look at what he's saying. What does he mean? Story truth is truer sometimes than happening truth. How does this relate to the idea of metafiction? Notice the way he's kind of talking about telling stories, and start to think about why he's using metafiction, because that's going to be the Flipgrid post. Okay, so go ahead and pause, think about those questions, maybe write about them, call someone and talk about it who's also doing this lesson. Okay, next we're going to read notes. I'm going to read it aloud again, but feel free to pause and read it to yourself and then, fast forward me reading it. I didn't put the page numbers on the slide. I apologize. Note starts on page 149, and it's just after Speaking of Courage, which we talked about yesterday. All right, so again, look at what we're learning about Boker, what are we learning about O'Brien, what do we learn about writing, and think about why this chapter is here and how it all connects to metafiction. Notes. Speaking of Courage was written in 1975 at the suggestion of Norman Boker, who 3 years later hanged himself in the locker room of a YMCA in his hometown in central Iowa. In the spring of 1975, near the time of Saigon's final collapse, I received a long, disjointed letter in which Boker described the problem of finding a meaningful use for his life after the war. He had worked briefly as an automotive parts salesman, a janitor, a car wash attendant, and a short-order cook at the local A&W fast food franchise. None of these jobs, he said, had lasted more than 10 weeks. He lived with his parents, who supported him and who treated him with kindness and obvious love. At one point, he had enrolled in the junior college in his hometown, but the coursework, he said, seemed too abstract, too distant, with nothing real or tangible at stake, certainly not the stakes of a war. He dropped out after 8 months. He spent his mornings in bed. In the afternoons, he played pickup basketball at the Y, and then at night he drove around town in his father's car, mostly alone or with a six-pack of beer, cruising. The thing is, he wrote, there's no place to go. Not just in this lousy little town, in general. My life, I mean. It's almost like I got killed over in Nam. Hard to describe. That night when Kiowa got wasted, I sort of sank down into the sewage with him. Feels like I'm still in deep shit. The letter covered 17 handwritten pages, its tone jumping from self-pity to anger to irony to guilt to a kind of feigned indifference. He didn't know what to feel. In the middle of the letter, for example, he reproached himself for complaining too much. God, this is starting to sound like some jerk-off bag crying in his beer. Sorry about that. I'm no basket case, not even any bad dreams, and I don't feel like anybody mistreats me or anything, except sometimes people act too nice, too polite, like they're afraid they might ask the wrong question. But I shouldn't bitch. One thing I hate, really hate, is all those whiner vets, guys sniveling about how they didn't get any parades. Such absolute crap. I mean, who in his right mind wants a parade or getting his back clapped by a bunch of patriotic idiots who don't know jack about what it feels like to kill people or get shot at or sleep in the rain or watch your buddy go down underneath the mud? Who needs it? Anyhow, I'm basically A-okay, home free, so why not come down for a visit sometime and we'll chase pussy and shoot the breeze and tell each other old war lies, a good long bull session, you know? I felt it coming, and near the end of the letter, it came. He explained that he had read my first book, If I Die in a Combat Zone, which he liked, except for the bleeding heart political parts. For half a page, he talked about how much the book had meant to him, how it brought back all kinds of memories, the villas and patties and rivers, and how he recognized most of the characters, including himself, even though almost all of the names were changed. Then Boker came straight out with it. What you should do, Tim, is write a story about a guy who feels like he got zapped over in that shithole. A guy who can't get his act together, just drives around town all day and can't think of any damn place to go. Doesn't know how to get there anyway. This guy wants to talk about it, but he can't. If you want, you can use the stuff in this letter, but not my real name, okay? I'd write it myself, except I can't ever find any words, if you know what I mean. And I can't figure out what exactly to say. Something about the field that night. The way Kiowa just disappeared into the crud. You were there. You can tell it. Norman Boker's letter hit me hard. For years I'd felt a certain smugness about how easily I'd made the shift from war to peace. A nice, smooth glide, no flashbacks or midnight sweats. The war was over after all, and the thing to do was to go on. So I took pride in sliding gracefully from Vietnam to graduate school, from Quang Ngai to Harvard, from one world to another. In ordinary conversation, I never spoke much about the war, certainly not in detail. And yet ever since my return, I've been talking about it virtually nonstop through my writing. Telling stories seemed a natural, inevitable process, like clearing the throat. Partly catharsis, partly communication. It was a way of grabbing people by the shirt and explaining exactly what had happened to me, how I'd allowed myself to get dragged into a wrong war, all the mistakes I'd made, all the terrible things I'd seen and done. I did not look on my work as therapy and still don't. Yet when I received Norma Boker's letter, it occurred to me that the act of writing had led me through a swirl of memories that might otherwise have ended in paralysis or worse. By telling stories, you objectify your own experience. You separate it from yourself. You pin down certain truths. You make up others. You start sometimes with an incident that truly happened, like the night in the shipfield, and you carry it forward by inventing incidents that did not in fact occur, but that nonetheless help to clarify and explain. In any case, Norman Boker's letter had an effect. It haunted me for more than a month. Not the words so much as its desperation, and I resolved finally to take him up on his story suggestion. At the time I was at work on a new novel, going after Cacciato, And one morning I sat down and began a chapter titled Speaking of Courage. The emotional core came directly from Booker's letter, the simple need to talk, to provide a dramatic frame. I collapsed events into a single time and place, a car circling a lake on a quiet afternoon in midsummer, using the lake as a nucleus around which the story would orbit. As he requested, I did not use Norman Boker's name, instead substituting the name of my novel's main character, Paul Berlin. For the scenery, I borrowed heavily from my own hometown, wholesale thievery, in fact. I lifted up Worthington, Minnesota, the lake, the road, the causeway, the woman in paddle pushers, the junior college, the handsome houses and docks and boats and public parks, and carried it all a few hundred miles south and transplanted it onto the Iowa prairie. The writing went quickly and easily. I drafted the piece in a week or two, fiddled with it for another week, then published it as a separate short story. Almost immediately, though, there was a sense of failure. The details of Norman Boker's story were missing. In this original version, which I still conceived as part of the novel, I had been forced to omit the shipfield and the rain and the death of Kiowa, replacing this material with events that better fit the book's narrative. As a consequence, I'd lost the natural counterpoint between the lake and the field. A metaphoric unity was broken. What the piece needed and did not have was the terrible killing power of that shipfield. As the novel developed over the next year, and as my own ideas clarified, it became apparent that the chapter had no proper home in the larger narrative. Going after Cacciata was a war story. Speaking of Courage was a post-war story. Two different time periods, two different sets of issues. There was no choice but to remove the chapter entirely. The mistake, in part, had been in trying to wedge the piece into a novel. Beyond that, though, something about the story had frightened me. I was afraid to speak directly, afraid to remember, and in the end the piece had been ruined by a failure to tell the full and precise truth about our night in the shipfield. Over the next several months, as it often happens, I managed to erase the story's flaws from my memory, taking pride in a shadowy, idealized recollection of its virtues. When the piece appeared in an anthology of short fiction, I sent a copy off to Norman Boker with the thought that it might please him. His reaction was short and somewhat bitter. "It's not terrible," he wrote me. "You left out Vietnam. Where's Kiowa? Where's the ship?" 8 months later, he hanged himself. In August of 1978, his mother sent me a brief note explaining what had happened. He'd been playing pickup basketball at the Y. After 2 hours, he went out for a drink of water. He used a jump rope. His friends found him hanging from a water pipe. There was no suicide note, no message of any kind. Norman was a quiet boy, his mother wrote, and I don't suppose he wanted to bother anybody. Now, a decade after his death, I'm hoping that Speaking of Courage makes good on Norman Boker's silence, and I hope it's a better story. Although the old structure remains, the piece has been substantially revised, in some places by severe cutting, in other places by the addition of new material. Norman is back in the story where he belongs, and I don't think he would mind that his real name appears. The central incident, our long night in the shipfield along the Sang Trebang, has been restored to the piece. It was hard stuff to write. Kiowa, after all, had been a close friend, and for years I've avoided thinking about his death and my own complicity in it. Even here, it's not easy. In the interest of truth, however, I want to make it clear that Norman Boker was in no way responsible for what happened to Kiowa. Norman did not experience a failure of nerve that night. He did not freeze up or lose the Silver Star for valor. That part of the story is my own. All right, so I want you to pause again, think about what we're learning in this story. How is it an example of metafiction? And then I'll explain the Flipgrid post next. So we've read 2 short chapters today, right? I told you what metafiction is. Here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to post a response to Flipgrid, and I'd like you to answer one of these questions. What's another example of metafiction from a different chapter in the book? It could actually be from one of the ones I read today, because I didn't talk about what was metafiction in them. So any chapter really where you're seeing it, metafiction. What is the effect of metafiction on the reader? You can answer. Or why do you think O'Brien uses metafiction? Some thoughts on that. So pick one of the questions, answer. Try to reference details in the book. I will post a response for those of you still kind of struggling with what metafiction is. Watch my response, and I'll provide a couple of examples, and maybe that will help clarify it even more. But again, you're looking for ways that he is talking about writing within this book and talking about how to tell a story, how to craft characters, how to craft setting. So look for examples of that. All right, have a good Tuesday, you guys.